Okay, we are going to start. Welcome to the House Divided class discussion. We are discussing chapter 6 today on Islamic extremism, and our class leader will be Jeff Klaus. Before we start, we'd like to do our usual announcements. First thing is the mute button is in the lower left corner of your screen. If you would click on that so the red line goes through mute and we can control the background noise better that way. And also we are recording this for future playback and for those who cannot be with us live tonight. So please be aware we're recording this and it will be posted and shared. And the last thing is please be kind to our speaker and to each other. Just a request and a reminder. Okay, with that, I want to give you Jeff Klaus, a longtime St. Andrew member and teacher in our classes and an attorney and very knowledgeable on social issues person. So Jeff, thank you for leading tonight.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks everybody for letting me be part of the class and do some of these sessions. I want to remind everyone to again, as Steve did, to stay on mute as much as you can, unless you're ready to talk. Go ahead and raise your hand or use the icon for raising your hand, and we'll try to call on people when it's time to do the sharing and take as much turns as possible and give everybody as much of a chance to chime in. So try to keep comments relatively brief. And if there's opportunities to come back and elaborate and talk more, certainly we'll let everyone talk as much as we can do in the time allowed. This is, of course, an interesting topic, and we're doing Islamic extremism, and Mark was very specific in his chapter to talk about what kind of issues he was addressing in that book, but it occurred to me that extremism in any form is very problematic. And I don't know if we react to extremism differently, if it's about one subject or another, but any kind of extremism that produces terrorism seems like something we would necessarily have to address and deal with. I kind of thought that the book was attempting to address our tendency to unfair the lumping of extremists of one particular group with the rest of that group. In maybe it was a bad logic problem where we had two seemingly true premises. Some terrorists are Islamic and some Islamic people are terrorists. And then we make a bad assumption that all Islamic people are terrorists. And that was kind of my takeaway of the problem that the book was trying to address. And I was kind of wanting to throw that out for our initial thing as to what you all thought was the problem. And maybe one way to reframe the question was, or the problem is, how do we feel about using the word extremist or maybe radical with other terms, like a radical, someone that's into extreme sports, or radical capitalism, or radical Christianity, or could you be a donut extremist? Anybody have, I think Homer Simpson is, but anybody have any thoughts or reactions as to really kind of what the problem this chapter is addressing? Go ahead, Ron.
Tom.
I'm not
Ron.
Yeah, Ron first. And then
as I started reading this, I tried to frame the whole thing on a quote from a Barbara Brown Taylor book called Holy Envy. She's a professor of comparative religions at a Southern college, and she teaches about all the different religions in the world. But one of the things she said is never attempt to categorize a religion by its worst parts. And I immediately try to think that about that in here as you know, so many times we could do the same thing if, you know, like Christ said about the speck in your eye and the log in someone else's. We could look at the Christians and what we did during the Crusades, things like that. So I really love that idea of never judging a people or a religion or anything by its worst parts.
Yeah, that's a great way to zero it in. Someone else had their hand up.
I'm not Mary. I'm using Mary's computer.
Okay, Mary, go for it.
I had a physician on my staff who was Muslim. And initially he wore some of his clothes, the headgear, the whole thing. But he found out that he was disrespected when he was wearing that. And his wife the same, the headdress and everything. So they dressed in English American clothes and everything was fine. And he was a great guy. He was not an extremist. But it's funny how discrimination covers a lot of different groups.
Yeah, I want to come back to that in particular because I think, you know, a lot of us don't necessarily have a lot of interactions with people that practice Islam. I'd like to just move to the axioms because I think the book is structured to give us some truisms, something that we can agree on, and then we can use those points of agreement to see how those inform the rest of our decision, how that helps us answer some of the more prickly questions. The first axiom in this is Islam is one of three major monotheistic religions in the world. Any reaction or comment to that axiom? Or how does that, what's your takeaway from that? That was my way. Whenever I read the axioms, I would try to think of what's my takeaway from that? How does that inform my thinking? My takeaway was, you know, that there are a lot of Islamic people in the world, and if they are like all the other religions, they are all not like each other. That there's probably a lot of diversity in Islam thinking, just like there is Christianity.
But there's also a lot of...
Janet's.
Yeah, I, for a number of years, taught English as a second language down on the Auraria campus. So I had a number of Islamic students. There's at least three that I know of, separate sects. And most of my students were Saudi. So when we get to the axiom and all of the part on 75, page 75 in the book, I have more that I want to say about that. But as far as the three monotheistic, according to my students, Jesus was a great prophet. He was not the Son of God. He was a great prophet. And my students were very interested in any books that I had that talked about Christianity. There, as they had been taught, and I remember this is specifically the Saudi Wasabi Islam, and I wouldn't talk to any other, but they felt that Muhammad, or that they were taught that Muhammad felt that he had to correct how people had gone astray from Jesus's teachings, love your neighbor and so forth, and felt that Christians had lost their way. And that was part of his reason for starting Islam.
Yeah, that's a great point. So maybe he was trying to reform from the outside Christianity or Judaism for that matter. I thought I had read that Muhammad was very influenced by Jewish communities that lived in Mecca at the time and Medina, and maybe was jealous that they had a book. They were called the People of the Book. I don't know if anyone's heard about that, but
they never addressed that part, but we did. It was not unusual for me to end up at them starting it to have discussions about Jesus.
Yeah. Do you think you could be a Christian and view Jesus as a prophet as opposed to the Son of God?
Well, me personally, that would be no. But you know, it would, one of the things during one Lent, one of the things that they said that has stuck with me forever. Harvey, you were giving out the little crosses from Jerusalem, and I had put mine on a string and had it under my shirt, but I was helping different students and it came out. And so we had a discussion about Lent and how it was sort of like Ramadan and so forth. And what has stuck with me is one of my students, in all seriousness, asked me if any of the other teachers were Christian, because they did not see them as Christian.
Because they didn't wear a cross? No,
because of their behavior.
Oh, yeah.
They did not feel, because we had had conversations about Jesus and we had had these different discussions. I don't mean that they were acting sinfully or anything. I mean that I had actually, they had felt comfortable asking me about Christianity, and evidently they had not felt comfortable asking the other teachers, and so they didn't feel that they were Christian. It may just have been the classes I was teaching vis-a-vis the classes they were teaching.
Interesting. That's interesting, that their observation or not observation. Bob, did you have your hand up?
Yeah. One of the criticisms of Islam is that they do not worship our God. But since we and they both worship one God, how can you tell the difference?
Right. And I would think a lot of people would say it is the same God. I mean, it's all the God of Abraham. And so it's kind of gets a little muddled. I mean, we call our God God using an English word, and they call their God Allah using an Arabic word, which means God. If they were speaking English, which, I mean, the language of Islam is traditionally Arabic, but yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, if we're all worshiping
the same God, and any of my students, if you wanted to listen to the whole thing, could tell you their personal ancestry all the way back. And Harvey, tell me if I get it wrong. Not Isaac, but Ishmael.
Yes.
The other, the son of the prostitute or the servant. Who was it, Harvey?
Hagar. It wasn't. She was. She's a concubine.
No, it was Isaac. Was the son? He had two. Abraham had two sons. One from his wife and one from his concubine. What was the name of the son from his concubine?
Ishmael.
Ishmael. I was right. Okay. They trace back to Ishmael, and they consider themselves first because Ishmael was born first.
That is right.
Yeah, but it's important to remember too, they claim Abraham as well.
Right.
They are an Abrahamic faith. And
premise to Abraham through Ishmael over Isaac because Isaac was the second born son.
Right. And I think, it's important to see that when you talk about them worshiping the same God, that, from what I've learned, Islam is fundamentally different than Christianity in a lot of ways. It's very distinct. It's not a salvic religious system. Their concept of salvation is way, way different than ours.
Correct.
And so, to say it's the same, I think that's a leap because they don't view and they don't worship God and they don't kind of interpret God the way that we do.
I don't think anyone was saying that they were the same religion. I think we were just saying that we both trace our roots back to the same God, the God of Abraham. And there's probably a lot of differential practices. Would you agree with that, I think, Jerry? Or
yeah, no, I would. I just think, I think, that fundamentally that's the biggest difference between us. I mean, what's really interesting is that, you mentioned Jesus, And Jesus and Mary are actually mentioned more in the Quran than they are in all four Gospels combined. And if you go over there and you look at the Dome of the Rock, that temple, there's a lot of like calligraphy on the outside of the Dome of the Rock. And those are actually scriptures from the Quran about Mary and Joseph and Jesus. And so it's, they highly revere Jesus, but they don't understand Jesus to be a prophet. And they're a very singular based religion. You know what I mean? Like there's no separation. God can't be separate. So the idea of the Trinity to them is heresy. It's absolute heresy. So
Jesus is seen to be a prophet by Islam, but has been superseded by Muhammad.
Right.
Right. And that's a major tenet, you know, this idea of superseding. Even Sharia law, you know, that's what Sharia law is. It's basically a system built on jurisprudence, right? It's a system built on judicial decisions that have taken place over the years. So,
well, since we're talking about kind of some of the nuances of Islam and the practice of Islam, that I think leads us really nicely to the second axiom, which is violence is neither a normative behavior nor a core tenet of Islam. And that's Mark's second axiom. And we've been talking about the tenets and practices of Islam. Anybody have any insight as to that tenet? My takeaway was to not judge a book by some of the people that read it. But that seems true to me, and that's true to my experience with knowing a few Islamic people, that everyone I've known is very non-violent and very what I would call, you know, about their family and about their work and about their faith, practicing their faith the way they know it, you know, with the prayer and the giving of alms and pilgrimaging. Anybody got further insight into that? Yeah, I think we probably all see how that works with Christianity, where there are so many violent verses in the Bible and stories in the Bible, but we don't consider Christianity or Judaism to be a violent religion. And it's to me, it's sort of somewhat about framing. And someone have a comment? Oh. Where I heard an example recently where, you know, we frame things differently because of how we learn about it in the first place. And if we had heard the story of a very conservative Southern Baptist man murdering his wife because she wanted a divorce, we would probably not frame that as an honor killing or religious. It would be domestic violence. And we would look at it from secular lens because we're all Christians of something, and we would say that, oh, it was wrong secularly, and to the degree her asking for a divorce and that being a forbidden act was somehow reinforced by his faith, we would probably not frame it that way. How about the next axiom is Islamic terrorism emerges not from religion, but from religion's wicked partners.
Okay, I have my ongoing story to tell about that. I came into my class one morning. I had, say, 6 Islamic students, all from Saudi Arabia, who regularly sat as a group, and one guy who sat by himself. The 6 always dressed in what Arabic students considered to be Western style, very nicely dressed. He looked like he could pass for an American. And I came in one morning and they were yelling at each other. He never sat with them. They were yelling at each other in Arabic, and he stomped out of the class. And this was in the 1990s. And I asked them, you know, what had gone on, and they had gotten into an argument because he followed a different prophet than they did. And the prophet's name was Osama bin Laden. He got very angry because he was planning to attend Metro and was disappointed to discover that they did not have planes to learn how to fly, and transferred to Florida.
Well, in that example, how did you learn any more about why the other ones didn't want to associate with him?
Yeah, because they did not, well, they considered Osama bin Laden sort of a prophet. They did not follow him. And by the way, he said to me, he was going to learn to be a pilot because he had wanted to be a policeman in Saudi Arabia and he had not passed the test. And it really struck home for me whenever they were talking about that the terrorism comes from a slight or I forget how Mark put it in the book, but he had a lot of anger over that, which my feeling is, and this is just my feeling, that Osama bin Laden and his group had managed to turn against Americans.
Yeah.
I don't know if he was one of the ones that flew into the towers.
Anyone have any other insights about that, or in particular, the axiom that we're talking about in the book that terrorism really emerges from religion, not but from its wicked partner? Another way maybe to put that, and my takeaway from that was that the root of terrorism is not necessarily religion itself, but that people bent on terrorism use religion as a vehicle to justify or as grounds for the position that would drive them to terrorism.
That's exactly what Osama bin Laden did. He felt
Steve comment. I think he had his hand up next to
back.
Janet, do you mind?
Was to take back the world that they had conquered during the Middle Ages.
Okay, let's let Steve have a chance. I think he had his hand up.
Thank you, Jeff. I was just going to read the way Mark.
Steve Baska?
Pardon me? I was just going to read the way Mark phrased it in the book. He said, terrorism begins with a sense of injury, either personal or collective, and a yearning to correct that injury through revenge and domination. And using religion is simply a way to extract that revenge. I thought he did a good job of summing that up. It doesn't come straight out of religion. It comes out of some personal injury or grievance somebody feels like they have, and then they justify it by plucking something out of their religion.
That seemed to ring true to me. Anyone else have any other views on that or input? Or I don't want to limit that either. I mean, Janet?
Well, the thing that surprised me, Janet W.
Yeah.
The thing that surprised me about the definition was that apparently terrorism is defined through the Patriot Act as coming from a foreign country. And I had never seen it or heard it defined that way. So does that mean that terrorism cannot be a domestic act of violence?
I'm not sure the book got that completely right. If maybe someone else knows more about it, but I did a little research into it, and there's two types of terrorism defined in the Patriot Act, and the Patriot Act does not make terrorism a crime at all. It does not criminalize it, but it gives the federal government certain investigatory powers and confiscation powers that officials that are charging people with other criminal terrorist acts can use to enhance either their investigation or their way they can seize assets. My understanding is that the Patriot Act broadened the definition of domestic terrorism so broad, in fact, that includes potentially groups like Greenpeace, Operation Rescue, WTO protesters, the Veracruz Island protesters. So I'm not an expert on the Patriot Act, but reviewing the act and a couple articles on it, I'm not sure that it's limited to foreign countries or foreign organizations. Anybody got any information on that? I think there was, yeah, go ahead, Wanda. You might have to unmute yourself. Wanda, you need to unmute yourself.
I didn't have anything. I don't know what I touched that made you think I did.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, it looked like you had your hand up, so I wanted to give you a chance.
Oh, I was probably messing with my computer here.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
Jeff, Megan had her hand up.
Okay, yeah, and thanks, Steve, for helping me spot people. Go ahead, Megan.
Hi, yeah, you're correct, Jeff. There's a group of domestic terrorism organizations that are defined by the FBI and a group of foreign terrorism organizations. And both are treated similarly in terms of what sort of rights and responsibilities the FBI has to investigate and mitigate the terrorism risk. I'm a therapist by trade, by training, and run the statewide crisis response system for the state of Colorado. And we do some work with the Department of Homeland Security on identifying like terrorism threats. And sort of what we've been talking about in this group is correct, that it's not that a person strongly identifies with a religion or a movement. They strongly identify with that feeling of being wronged or mistreated or isolated, and whatever group or organization capitalizes on that vulnerability and sort of exploits it to get people sort of within their reach and then start practicing whatever those beliefs are, whether that's radical Islam or PETA. So they sort of get them within their grasp and then sort of indoctrinate with radical beliefs, but capitalize on that vulnerable, sort of disgruntled, angry individual who needs someone to relate to them and give fuel to their discontent in life.
That's super helpful, very helpful. Yes, Janet W.
So like this group that was planning the kidnapping of the Michigan governor, they could be considered a terrorist group.
So it depends. There are specific organizations that are defined as domestic terrorist groups, defined by the Department of Homeland Security. And so if they espoused the beliefs and practices of a certain group, then yes. But then otherwise, it's classified as some other sort of crime, a hate crime or conspiracy or whatever. But there are only, I think, like 8 or 11 actually designated domestic terrorist groups by the Department of Homeland Security.
Interesting.
And if I understand it right, then they're, in addition to the other hate crimes that may be on the books of states around the country, that certain states have enacted laws that might qualify as criminalizing something that's terrorist. Harvey.
Why do we think Mark chose just to focus on Islamic terrorism in this chapter?
Anybody want to chime in? I mean, my view on that comes back to our original purpose of why we have this chapter at all, was to not be so blindly willing to stereotype an entire group by the acts of a few, and particularly where their whole entire religious beliefs are being oversimplified, kind of dumbed down, and said that that's what all Islamic people believe, is that violence is the answer and terrorism is the means to carry it out. Harvey, what would you say?
I would reinforce that. And I think that's where the misunderstandings are. I think we have enormous misunderstandings about Islam. Jerry differentiated us well in some ways between Christianity and Islam. But look at what we have in common. Look at the 5 pillars of Islam. Particularly praying 5 times a day. Well, what if faithful followers of Christ took time out 5 times a day to be in prayer? Charity, my understanding of Islam from being in lectures from imams and doing some reading in books like Adam Hamilton's World Religion book, the giving, the financial giving a faithful Muslim is expected to do each year is 2.5% of their wealth, not their income, of their wealth. Fasting, which was one of the core Wesleyan spiritual practices, we have some things in common. What if faithful followers of Jesus were as disciplined about our spiritual disciplines? And I know Jerry's teaching a class on that using Wesley's spiritual practices, but what if we were that faithful?
Yeah, and I want to point out to all of you that, I tend to think academically about these things. So, I try to look for differences, right? And try to make those distinctions. But, I want to assure you that while there may be distinctions, I've personally spent a lot of time with our Muslim brethren and sisters. In the community where I live in Dallas, the majority of my neighbors were there, and they were Muslim. And there was a big mosque right down the street from my house that I used to visit once a year at Ramadan. And, I want to stress that even though there are differences, they are essentially a beautiful people. I mean, at their root, they are a beautiful, beautiful people. And while we can agree on certain tenets of our belief, that doesn't negate the fact that the majority of them that I met were just incredible human beings. And like Harvey's saying, one thing we can admire about them is they take the practice of religion very seriously. I mean, it's not an option for them. And that's partly, I think, due to the fact that Islam by its very nature is a religion of submission. And that's what drives them. Even the word Muslim means one who submits. But that drives a lot of very impressive behavior. I don't know. I just want to point that out. I don't want to intimate that one is better than the other or anything like that. I think that we can all learn some really valuable lessons from all of our Islamic friends and from our Jewish friends as well. So.
Yeah, and I think to elaborate on one of the points I think you just mentioned, Jerry, was that maybe certain aspects of Christianity even sort of become domesticated by other cultural beliefs, whether it's was a Roman belief or a capitalist belief or this or that. That some of what maybe Christ taught has been kind of then taught out of us again by other philosophies. I'd like to squeeze in this last axiom real quick if we can, and then get to our video. And this was, I thought, the toughest axiom he put in here, but he said only the redeemed can redeem the world. Anybody have a thought or a takeaway about that? How do I distill that to use that in my thinking about answering questions about how I'm going to view Islamic extremist or any kind of extremist? made me think a little bit of when Jesus interrupted the casting of stones at the adulterous woman, and he kind of told them not to cast stones until they were without sin. I'm not sure that's a complete match, but
Jeff?
Yeah, Steve.
I read that axiom actually as being something like only the nonviolent can redeem the world. Because if we continue to repay violence for violence, it's just a perpetuating cycle. And only those who stop the cycle can redeem the world.
Very good. Hard to improve on that, so maybe we should just cut to the video.
Okay.
Raise your hand. Raise your hand. You're going to have to wave it. Talk.
As I look across this group tonight,
bringing it up. Can you see it on your screen yet?
He's bringing up the video.
Well, then
computer's a little slow.
Right.
Okay. Someone want to make a comment till it starts?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. As I look across this group tonight, I'd like to ask, whether you want to show hands or not, how many of you have been in Iraq or Afghanistan or other non-safe Middle Eastern countries? Yeah, it's gone now. So.
Jeff, whenever you're ready, I'll start the video.
Please do. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you see it?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, here we go.
Give me doubt so I can lay all my weapons on the ground. When the armor of God is too heavy for peace, give me doubt. Give me doubt.
Right now, an estimated 1 billion children and young adults worldwide are confined to their houses as a result of the school closures in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of them are spending unsupervised time online on gaming platforms where terrorist groups target vulnerable young people for radicalization. Extremists are seizing this opportunity to bolster their narrative and ideology, inspiring some individuals to commit acts of violence. But this is true not only of Islamic extremist groups, but of other terror groups, including far right-wing hate groups birthed right here on American soil. Terrorism and religious extremism are endemic to everyday life in the modern world, but it would be a grave mistake to assume that radical Islam is its sole proprietor. In March of 2020, FBI agents thwarted a plot by a 36-year-old Missouri man to firebomb a hospital where COVID-19 patients were being treated. The man was a potentially violent extremist who harbored racist and anti-government views and had also planned attacks on a mosque, a synagogue, and a black school. In the US, far right-wing extremist groups are building entire propaganda campaigns around the pandemic, stoking resentments against an array of supposed villains, from immigrants to ethnic minorities to politicians and health officials. Abroad, the Islamic State has routinely described the pandemic as divine punishment against Islam's enemies, calling on followers to take advantage of the weakened security environment to carry out terror attacks. Western countries are explicitly mentioned among the group's intended targets. In postings on social media sites, Islamic State leaders have predicted the imminent collapse of the US, crediting COVID-19 for helping to achieve that. Radical extremist groups, both domestic and abroad, have always been a threat to our modern way of life, but what fuels their hatred and violence is, at the core of it, not a particular religion or creed. At the heart of every extremist group's ideology is a sense of moral injury, personal or collective, and that's determination to correct that injury through revenge and violence. Terrorism always begins with a grievance, that is, I or we have been hurt, and this belief that some enemy, external, must be responsible. Only then does the terrorist reach for religion. Terrorists begin with a grievance or a hatred, and then pluck from Scripture whatever verses might help to create an ideology to justify whatever actions will make them feel righteous or heroic. Terrorism is an ideology of moral outrage, clothed in religious garb. How do we condemn all acts of Islamic extremism while rejecting any actions or rhetoric that would condemn the people of Islam, who are almost entirely a people of peace, and who happen to share a branch with Christians and Jews on the Abrahamic family tree? Perhaps it begins with getting to know the basic principles of Islam and getting to know some of the 3.5 million Muslims currently living in the U.S. The majority of non-Muslim U.S. Americans do not know a single Muslim. Half of Muslim Americans say it has become harder to be Muslim in the U.S. Nearly half say they have experienced at least one incident of discrimination just in the past 12 months. Many of our Muslim neighbors in the U.S. live with chronic fear and mistrust, largely because so many non-Muslims live in fear and mistrust of them. There's a better way of relating to our Muslim neighbors. We can condemn the actions committed in the name of Islam without condemning an entire group of people who practice Islam. We can confirm that terrorism is neither a normative behavior nor a core tenet of Islam, which means that we can surrender our fear and suspicion and find delight in the beauty of their tradition, acknowledging our kinship with Muslims as sons and daughters of Abraham, from whom we have all come. Perhaps by beginning there, we can find enough common ground to work together for the common good.
Give me doubt so I can see my neighbor as myself. Give me doubt so I can lay all my weapons on the ground. When the armor of God is too heavy for peace, I shall not fear.
Thanks, Steve. We're going to kind of try to drill down into some of these questions and some of the harder issues here. And I think one of the questions posed just before we broke for the video was, what kind of related to what our experience is, not only maybe as the questioner asked about people that had been in a war-torn country that's predominantly Islamic, such as Iraq or Afghanistan. But I would broaden that question to, our experience with Islamic people, in anywhere. Because I think, like Mark pointed out in the video and in the book, usually that's very limited. And I would imagine that in this group, people that have been to Iraq in the recently, outside of military service, would be very, very few. Charlotte and I got to visit this country of Jordan in 2016, during the middle of the Syrian civil war, and of course there was still a lot going on in Iraq at that time with ISIS and so forth, and talked to people that regularly went to Iraq. But firsthand experience, even that is pretty once or twice removed. I'm not sure, how qualified any of us are to speak to the details of Islamic life day in and day out. Anyone have something they want to share that they think is relevant? Yes. Mary Baker, Mary Kesker. I know you're not Mary.
But anyway, I think if you've traveled to foreign countries, if you're trying to know the people, you've got to speak the language. And so few of us speak Arabic. And I think that's a drawback. The other thing is, when I've had physicians visit, and actually one on my staff, it's like anybody, you got to get to know them. And they speak English, you speak English, and you can get a feeling as to what their thoughts are and how their religion is, and you can talk to them. But that's the way you do it, not just meeting them on the street walking by in a foreign country. I don't think.
No, and I think necessarily extrapolating about the whole Islamic experience from 2 or 3 war-broken countries that were probably war-broken in part due to the contribution of acts of outside countries such as our own. Judy Kraft email. Yeah, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have 2 experiences with Muslim people. For some time, my doctor was a Muslim lady, and since I taught government, she liked to talk politics with me and history. And her favorite day was the 4th of July, when she dressed up and rode in a parade on her horse as one of the founding fathers. Paul Revere was her hero. And my other experiences with Judy, for about 5 years, we were consultants to the Islamic Center for Education in Southern California, where their goal was to make sure all religions were presented in history books correctly. And Jabir Mansour, who started this program because his daughter was reading a major U.S. history 5th grade book, which said that Muslims rubbed their nose in the sand when they prayed, and had a picture of a Bedouin praying in the desert. And that was a major U.S. history textbook back in the 90s and 80s. And we worked with them for 5 years trying to make sure all U.S. history books presented all religions correctly.
Good for you.
So we had a great experience with them.
Yeah, our experience in Jordan was a little more than a casual one because we were staying at 2 different places for kind of a little bit of period of time, and we got to, and we were the only Westerners there at that time because this was after the Arab Spring, it was after 9/11, and after the Arab Spring, no one was traveling to Jordan, and they were so happy to see us that the owners of the resort, we ate with the owner meals, and he had special Bedouin dishes fixed for us, and so we got to visit with them a little bit more than that, and of course they were all very concerned about all the strife in those countries that were mentioned, Iraq and Afghanistan. They were very concerned about what was going on there and when it would get better and how it would look when it came out. They were concerned about an uncertain future, just the way I think we were. That's one of the first questions in the book was, how many people feel they have a good understanding of the tenets of Islam? And I was probably guessing we wouldn't have too many hands. Yeah, there we go. And you've helped us out a little bit already, Jerry. How about the other question, and this goes right to the point. Does anyone have feelings? And I don't think they're wrong feelings, because I think we're kind of fed a story that makes us maybe want to believe it. But does anyone have feelings that the Islamic religion is more inherently violent than other religions? Yeah, Ron.
Well, I kind of like throw these out as I'm thinking through these last questions and stuff. The Buddha had what he called the 3 poisons. He called it attachment, anger, and a lack of enlightenment or lack of understanding. And the attachment thing is not about attachment to an intimate relationship. It's more about attachment to a a belief system. And I'm seeing that so much. Mark talked about how these Muslim groups are recruiting young people into the violence. And what they're doing is they're teaching them an attachment to a specific type of Muslim faith that they're spewing. And they're filling them with anger and hatred. And then they're keeping them ignorant about how other possibilities are. And I also see that when people are saying, well, all the Muslims are terrorists because that's what the news says and everything. And it's the same three poisons. We're attaching a particular understanding to an entire group. We're feeding on the anger, and we're basically keeping ourselves in ignorance of what the rest of the people are like. So I'm seeing a lot of those three poisons throughout this, is how we're not moving past where we could be based on those poisons.
And I also wonder how much we're mixing up other grievances. I mean, if I lived in Iraq, I'm not sure how I would feel about U.S. occupation forces, regardless of what else I thought about. Anyone got thoughts about that?
He did. Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah,
when you said if you lived in Iraq, I did.
Yeah, so
for almost a year.
Please share.
And I was a contractor for the U.S. military, and in the end traveled all over Iraq and was engaged in many different kinds of activities, as well as a number of firefights. And I think we can say what we want to say and think what we want to think about the population in Iraq or Afghanistan. But until you've been there, until you've lived there, and until you've dealt with the population directly on.
He was asking about how they felt about the occupation. How did they feel about it?
I don't think they feel about the occupation, if you want to know the truth. I think you've seen enough recently that they just assumed we were gone, totally gone.
Right.
And when you look at Afghanistan, that's a little bit different issue, and you cannot compare the two together.
Yeah, I would agree that those are two completely different situations. And I think that was kind of my point exactly, that if I was in Iraq, I'm not sure I would want a single American there. Why would I? But, I mean, you can argue both sides of that, but I think there's legitimate Iraqi people that maybe are not terrorists, they're maybe not extremists, but they don't want a foreign government occupying their country.
Exactly.
Yeah, I had friends during the time he was there that were complaining because the Iraqi people were attacking just regular Iraqi people were attacking people. And I said, but how long would you feel happy with having a government that came in, blew up your water system, blew up your electrical system, blew up your telephones, you have no utilities, and now they're an occupying force? Would you really be happy with them there very long?
We have to destroy your country in order to save it.
Exactly. Thanks, but we don't need it destroyed.
Well, and I don't
think that was a lot of the attitude that he found.
I don't think the Afghani people were any more happy with the Russians than they were with us.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. And I think that crosses over even the question we're talking about tonight, because, we're wondering whether religion we're not really asking.
Exactly.
Well,